Let me see your papers. Now, the sentence hit before the woman behind the counter finished explaining a dosage line. She stopped with the label still between her fingers, not dropping it, not answering fast enough for the man already stepping closer. She lifted her eyes once, ready to clarify the prescription. But the next order cut through the space again. Papers. Right now. Officer Blake Anderson moved forward without asking her name. His head tilted as he leaned in, blocking half the counter with his arm. His other hand rested on his belt. Touching equipment he didn't lift, she slid the medication across to the older man waiting. Told him to call the store if anything felt unclear. He nodded once, taking an extra half step before turning away. He shuffled away with the bottle tucked into a side pocket of his jacket. She straightened, her coat pulling tighter as she shifted her weight. How can I help you? A short tap on the glass answered her. 2 knuckles. Quick. Dismissive. Officer Blake Anderson adjusted the edge of his belt with the other hand before letting it drop. Identification. And proof you're allowed to work here. Her fingers stayed on the counter a moment longer. Not pulling back yet. The pharmacy license hung on the wall behind her. Clean frame. Clear print. Full name visible under the state seal. She gestured with one hand. My license is... That doesn't prove status. The interruption was flat. Officer Blake Anderson's eyes stayed on her badge, not returning to the frame. His eyes drifted to her face, then back to her badge. Name doesn't match the complaint. She repeated her name. He repeated a different one, similar enough that she had to correct it again. It's Carter. His eyes dropped to the frame once more. Carver. Right. Papers. A customer near the vitamin aisle lifted a phone. The lens pointed toward the counter. Officer Blake Anderson's head stayed fixed toward the counter, not turning toward the raised phone. The phone stayed raised, the angle steady, thumb hovering near the screen. Her hand moved toward the drawer where prescription forms were kept. She opened it halfway, then closed it again without taking anything out. I'm a licensed pharmacist. Born in Houston. What is this concerning? You can clear it up by showing documentation. Another customer froze near the pickup window, bag of cough drops in hand. The bell above the entrance door stopped chiming from the officer's arrival, but the quiet that replaced it stayed flat. No footsteps shifting around her. The air conditioner clicked off near the wall clock showing 3:17, the sudden stillness settling over the counter space. Officer Blake Anderson adjusted his glove. It wasn't needed for anything he was doing. It still formed a short, sharp snap when he pulled the edge. We've had identity fraud here. Who is suspected? You. Step aside if you're not cooperating. Step aside. She didn't move. Her hand rested on the counter's wooden trim, thumb tapping once before staying still. She looked past him to the small gate, checking the gap between the hinges. He followed her line of sight, then walked toward it without explanation. That area is restricted. I'll verify your status myself. He reached for the latch. She reached for it too. Her fingers landed on top of the metal just before his touched the side. She didn't push, only held the latch in place. The contact wasn't forceful, but it stopped his movement for the briefest second, long enough for him to shift weight forward. Move. For what reason? Move. The latch clicked when he pressed harder. The gate swung inward, brushing her hip as she stepped back. Shelves of pill bottles filled the narrow strip behind her. She lifted both hands slightly, not high, not raised, just clear of the latch. Cold metal touched her wrist before both arms were fully behind her. The cuff tightened with a single click, followed by a shorter one for the other hand. Her ID badge dragged slightly against the front of her coat as she adjusted her stance to keep balance. A shelf of pharmacy bags rustled when her shoulder brushed it. Her purse sat on the back counter. Officer Jenna Brooks paused halfway down the aisle. Search it. We don't have... She's under arrest. Incident to arrest. Do it. A small pause, then slow steps. The purse was lifted, opened, and inspected. Wallet unfolded, Cards were removed one by one. A Texas driver's license. Passport card. A social security card. A DEA registration. Each item landed on the counter in a short line. Officer Blake Anderson tightened his grip for a moment, then loosened it without saying anything. He turned her toward the exit, guiding her past customers who stepped back into narrow aisles to make space. A beep sounded from his radio as the mic toggled itself half open when his vest shifted. He tapped it once, missing the fact that the channel hadn't fully closed. Static cut through the steady hum overhead while he walked her outside. Heat pushed in from the open doorway as they stepped outside. She blinked against it as the patrol car door opened. Get in. The lock clicked behind her. The camera on his vest caught her reflection in the partition. Coat wrinkled. Cuff chain resting against the seat. Breath steady enough to lift her shoulders once. Subscribe to Power Abuse Stories to support more reporting like this. The patrol car door shut once more behind Officer Blake Anderson as he circled to the driver's side. Aaliyah Carter stayed in the back seat. Hands cuffed. Wrists pulled forward slightly to ease the angle. The metal divider reflected a warped outline of her coat. The crease across the collar still showing where she had pinched it earlier at the counter. Light from the rear window slid across her coat as the car turned. Officer Jenna Brooks settled into the passenger seat, her vest shifting with a soft scrape. The air inside stayed warm, the vents blowing the same low stream without change. Aaliyah pressed her spine against the seat, trying to keep the cuffs from biting her wrists. A small slip of receipt paper lay near her shoe. One edge creased hard. The engine turned over, transporting. Officer Anderson spoke toward the radio. Short and clipped, the patrol car pulled out of the lot. Engine noise and low static filled the cabin without a break. Her breath lifted her chest once and settled. She blinked once at the blur of storefronts moving past. Aaliyah shifted her hands again, the chain clicking lightly between wrists. Anderson didn't look back. Brooks glanced once in the mirror, then redirected her eyes toward the windshield. Traffic slowed 2 blocks down. The patrol car crawled behind a delivery van. The brake lights flared red across the divider. Aaliyah leaned her cuffed hands forward a few inches to ease a pinch along the inside of her wrist. The metal touched the seat back again when the car hit a small pothole. Brooks adjusted her body cam mount with 2 fingers. Neither officer said anything in the front seats. Aaliyah held her breath for 1 count when the radio crackled, then released it quietly once the channel cleared. The precinct lot came into view 20 minutes later. The cruiser rolled through the gate, its tires thumping over the transitioning concrete. Aaliyah watched the gate close behind them through the rear window. Officer Anderson parked near the intake door. Watch your step. He opened the rear door. One hand on the top edge. Aaliyah lifted herself slowly, keeping her balance by shifting weight to 1 foot first. The cuffs rising slightly with the movement. The heat in the enclosed lot pressed against her again. Inside, the intake corridor held a long bench, scuffed floor, and a booking window with a glass panel that didn't fully sit flush against its frame. A clock on the wall read 4:32. She kept her eyes on it for an extra second, marking the time without speaking. Sergeant. Mark Holloway stood behind the booking desk, one hand on a keyboard, the other resting on a stack of forms that slouched to one side. His gaze moved from Anderson to Aaliyah to the cuffs. What's the charge? Obstruction. Failure to provide identification. Holloway didn't write anything immediately. His pen tapped the form once. Aaliyah stayed standing, shoulders squared, wrists lifted slightly so the chain wouldn't scrape the counter edge. She shifted one heel back a notch and placed it forward again. Brooks lingered near the doorway, boots parallel, hands behind her belt. Holloway looked at Anderson again. What reasonable suspicion started the stop? Anderson paused. A complaint? What complaint? Identity fraud. What did you see that supported the complaint? The pen stopped tapping. Anderson didn't answer. His jaw shifted once. Holloway glanced at Brooks. You observe anything linked to fraud? Brooks adjusted the strap on her vest. No. He entered a case number on the keyboard. The clack of each key loud in the small room. Aaliyah kept her weight centered. feet apart just enough to stay steady. Move to Prince, Holloway instructed. Prince. Officer Anderson guided her toward the table. She stepped up when told. The cuff chain lifted briefly so the sensor could read each finger. The machine beeped after each impression. She allowed the technician to position her hand, her wrists rotating in the cuffs. The chains scraping lightly. A camera on a metal stand waited near the opposite wall. Face forward. Aaliyah didn't adjust her coat. She didn't try to smooth her hair. She stood in place until the shutter clicked once. The flash caught the glass panel behind the station for a second. Officer Jenna Brooks marked her belongings on a small form. Purse. Wallet. Keys. No medication. No loose items. No contraband. Brooks marked each item without commentary. Aaliyah watched the pen move down the lines, pausing at the section labeled verification. Her licenses had not been returned to her hand. They remained on the intake counter, arranged in a line similar to how they'd been placed in the pharmacy. A narrow hallway led to the holding. The floor changed from smooth tile to concrete, the texture rougher under her shoes. Aaliyah's shoes made a softer sound here. Anderson stayed a step ahead. Brooks trailed behind this time. They walked in a fixed order down the hallway. Aaliyah entered the holding cell when instructed. Holloway closed the door with a solid metal latch. She sat on the bench, adjusting the position of her wrists so the chain rested against her thigh instead of the wall. No one spoke for a while. Even the radio noise faded once the door shut completely. Through the small window on the cell door, the outline of Holloway's shoulders shifted as he spoke to Anderson at the desk. Her view caught Anderson's posture, angled slightly toward him. Aaliyah rested her back against the cool wall. Her breath lifted her shoulders once. She waited. The holding cell stayed quiet except for the steady hum from somewhere above the vents. Aaliyah Carter kept her back against the concrete wall, wrists resting on her lap, chain loose between her hands. Footsteps passed the cell once, then faded. Another set stopped, paused, and moved on. She stood after the latch clicked a second time. Officer Jenna Brooks opened it halfway. You're being released. Aaliyah stepped out, adjusting her balance after sitting so long. The hall lights reflected off the dull floor, the shine uneven where the mop hadn't reached. Brooks didn't walk beside her. He only stayed 2 paces behind. At the booking desk, Sergeant. Mark Holloway slid a small envelope across the counter. Her wallet and keys were inside. Her licenses were stacked in the corner, still in the same order Brooks had placed them earlier. Sign here. Aaliyah took the pen, the plastic body stiff from overuse. She signed once, then waited for Holloway to check the form. He stamped the bottom corner with a date block, the ink pad leaving a faint edge on the left side. Light from the precinct windows hit the pavement in a dull strip near her shoes. She turned away from it and walked toward the rideshare area without speaking. 5 days later, Aaliyah sat in a conference room at the ACLU office. A legal pad lay in front of her, blank except for a case intake number written by the receptionist. Attorney Daniel Ruiz organized several folders on the table, placing a body cam request form on top. His tie was loosened. Not from haste, but from repetition. Tell me what happened. Everything. She went through the sequence, stopping when Ruiz lifted a finger for clarification. He asked for the time she remembered the officers entering, whether the store cameras were visible, and whether any customer approached during the interaction. She answered each point, sometimes repeating a detail when he circled back. He closed the folder without adding anything beyond the next date line. When we get the footage, we move, Ruiz said. He submitted 3 record requests that afternoon, both body cams, dispatch audio, and the full CCTV coverage from the pharmacy. Ruiz watched him place each form into its envelope, tapping the flap once before sealing it with the edge of his palm. He didn't make promises. He only said, "We wait." Notices began arriving with stamped times in the upper corner. Aaliyah initialed several pages, each stamped with the same docket number at the top edge. Her pharmacy license sat among the exhibits in the file box. its state seal partly covered by a tag reading Exhibit C. She didn't read the commentary sections. Ruiz went through those alone. The judgment packet included a referral to internal affairs attached with a single staple. 3 weeks later, Aaliyah sat in the same room with the lights off while Ruiz loaded the footage onto the monitor. The timestamp appeared first. Ling Sen. Ling Si. 1:30 p.m. Anderson entering. Brooks is behind him. Aaliyah mid-sentence with the customer. Ruiz watched without pausing. He dragged the footage back a few seconds at a time, stopping at the gate, then at the latch, then at the cuffs. He let the static run over the speakers. The CCTV angle from above the pharmacy counter played next. Aaliyah watched herself leaning back when the gate hit her hip. Brooks's hesitation showed in that view. Her boots stayed in the same place when ordered to search the purse. A third angle showed customers stepping away from the aisles as Anderson walked her out. Ruiz clicked the monitor off. That's enough. We file. The next hearing opened with a shuffle of papers and a brief screen check at the front table. Ruiz asked her only for factual confirmation. Is that you? Yes. Is that the license you identified? Yes. A court clerk stepped in with a sealed notice dated 3 days after the hearing. Aaliyah stood when instructed, feet aligned with the edge of the bench. The jury foreperson read the findings. Liability on all counts. Compensatory and punitive damages totaling $15.9 million. A damages sheet on the clerk's desk listed $8.4 million in compensatory damages and $7.5 million in punitive damages. A line at the bottom noted it as the largest civil rights judgment recorded in the district. Aaliyah lowered herself back into the seat, the cuff chain on her wrist still leaving a shallow mark. A personnel bulletin posted near the clerk's station listed Officer Blake Anderson as terminated effective that afternoon. A separate entry on the same bulletin showed Officer Jenna Brooks reassigned to desk duty after a 2-month suspension. A department memo issued later outlined mandatory Fourth Amendment training and a ban on identification demands without articulable suspicion. Another memo assigned an independent monitor to review profiling complaints for the next audit cycle. Aaliyah signed the paperwork weeks later. Establishing the Fourth Amendment Defense Fund. A training request from a police academy arrived, asking for access to the synced footage for use in their sessions. Cars passed in uneven intervals near the intersection. Aaliyah checked her phone for the time. She adjusted the strap on her bag once before letting it fall back into place. Then she walked toward the corner without adjusting her pace. If you found this story meaningful, leave a comment. Share it with someone who needs to see it. And subscribe to Power Abuse Stories to support more reporting like this.